Who killed Gary Farris? The sinister truth behind Big Daddy's murder. True crime documentary. The night air was thick, still, unmoving. Gary Farris's mansion, usually alive with laughter and music, stood silent. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. The kind of quiet that made you wonder what it was hiding. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, distant and soft. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, moved through the shadows. His face was tense, drawn. His eyes darted from corner to corner. The house felt unfamiliar. The walls seemed to press in, as if they were watching him. Every creak of the floorboards sounded louder than the last. He reached the living room. There, lying in the center, was Big Daddy. Gary Farris, the man who ruled this town, was dead. His eyes stared up at the ceiling, unblinking. The blood had already started to dry. A sickening, dark stain that spread across the carpet like ink. The man froze. A chill ran down his spine. He couldn't breathe. For a moment, he thought he might faint. The smell, stale air mixed with something foul, clung to the walls. But there was something else. Something unsettling in the room. He turned his head, slowly. The mirror on the wall reflected his face, wide-eyed, sweating. He looked away quickly. It wasn't his reflection that bothered him. It was the shape in the corner. A figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was there. It wasn't supposed to be. The man's heart skipped a beat. Then it was gone. He blinked, confused, and tried to shake it off. His feet moved instinctively, closer to the body. He knelt beside Gary, staring down at the bloodied corpse. The question burned in his mind. Who did this? Who could have done this to Big Daddy? He glanced at the door. It was ajar. Someone had been here. Someone who didn't belong. And they were still here. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Suddenly, a soft rustle broke the silence. A shadow shifted in the corner again. The man whipped around, his eyes searching the dark room. Nothing. But the air felt heavier now. The tension was unbearable. His breathing came in shallow gasps. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. And whoever was still in this house, they weren't leaving without a fight. The man's hand tightened around the cold handle of the knife he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't remember picking it up. But it was there. Heavy. Cold. His breath echoed in his own ears. The room seemed to tilt slightly, like the walls were leaning in closer. He took a step back. Then another. His pulse raced faster with every inch he moved. The darkness felt thick now, suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat. Loud. Thumping in his chest like a drum. Was he imagining it? Had someone really been in the room with him? The thought made his skin prickle. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of the house felt like a threat. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. He was trapped. He turned toward the door. It was still open. A faint draft from the hallway brushed against his face. It was cold. Too cold for this time of year. His feet moved on their own, carrying him to the threshold. He peered down the dark corridor. There was nothing. Just the long, empty stretch of the hallway. But something felt off. The air felt thicker now, like it was pressing in on him, like it was trying to keep him there. And then, a noise. A scraping sound. Soft. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. He spun around. The room was empty. Gary's body lay motionless on the floor. Still. But in the silence, a new thought crept into his mind. What if Gary wasn't the first? What if the others were already dead? His stomach tightened. The darkness in the room felt like it was closing in around him. He wasn't just trapped in a house. He was trapped in something much darker. Something that had already claimed one life. And was hungry for more. He took another step forward, his eyes scanning the shadows. Every second felt like an eternity. He heard it again. A rustle. A shuffle. A breath. Then, a figure stepped into the doorway. A face he knew, but it was twisted. A smile that wasn't right. A glint of something in the eyes. Not fear, but something darker. Something dangerous. The man's throat went dry. He couldn't move. The smile stretched wider. And then the figure spoke. "You're not getting out of here. Not alive." The house remained still, as if nothing had happened. The silence stretched, thick and unbroken. Outside, the wind howled, but inside was a different kind of storm. The air was heavy with something dark, something ancient. A few feet away, the door to the living room creaked. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. Someone was there. A figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible at first. A silhouette in the dim light. It stepped forward, hesitant, careful. The man's body still lay on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. But the figure didn't flinch. It wasn't a stranger to death. The newcomer knelt beside the body, examining it closely. The blood was still warm, the body still fresh. But something wasn't right. The figure's hand hovered over the man's chest. A faint tremor ran through it, just a flicker of doubt. But it passed. This wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. The figure's eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room. Nothing had changed. Everything was as it should be. Except for one thing. Gary Farris was dead. And whoever had done this, whoever had killed Big Daddy, was still here. The figure stood, wiping its hands slowly. The room felt colder. It felt heavier. There was something unnerving about the stillness now. Something off. The figure turned and walked toward the doorway. But then, a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible creak. The figure froze. Its head snapped back toward the center of the room. The body. It wasn't still anymore. The man's fingers twitched. Just a slight movement. But enough. Enough to send a chill down the figure's spine. It couldn't be. The figure moved toward the body, its eyes wide. It was impossible. The man was dead. He had to be. But there was no mistaking it now. The body was shifting, the chest rising. A soft, shallow breath. A ragged, uneven gasp. The figure's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It was supposed to be over. But it wasn't. The body sat up. Slowly. Groaning. The eyes, once empty and lifeless, were now wide open. Staring, searching, hungry. The figure stepped back, panic creeping into its veins. "No. This isn't supposed to happen," the figure muttered, voice shaking. But the man who should have been dead, was no longer the man he once was. He was something else now. Something worse. The air was thick with dread. And as the body rose to its feet, the house held its breath. Everything shifted. Changed. And the night had only just begun. The figure stumbled backward, eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. The man, no, the thing that had once been a man, staggered to its feet, shaky and unsteady. Its eyes, clouded with confusion and rage, locked onto the figure in the doorway. A guttural sound escaped from its throat, low and rasping, like an animal in pain. The figure's breath caught in its chest. It reached for the doorframe, steadying itself. The darkness in the room seemed to pulse, to throb with a life of its own. There was a pressure in the air now, thick and suffocating. The man, or whatever it was, took a slow, dragging step forward. Each movement seemed forced, unnatural. Its limbs jerking with a strange, mechanical precision. But its eyes, those eyes, still held something human. Something pleading. Desperate. The figure stood frozen, unable to move, eyes locked on the corpse-like thing that had once been a person. "Gary," it whispered, voice cracking with a mixture of fear and regret. The thing's head twitched, its gaze sharp, focusing in on the voice. Then it spoke. Barely a whisper, yet sharp and cold. "Not Gary anymore." The words hung in the air like a curse, unnatural and chilling. The figure's heart pounded in its chest, a terrifying realization settling in. What had been done to Gary Farris? What had turned him into this? The man, no, the thing, took another dragging step, its face twisted in an agonized grimace. Then, without warning, it lunged. A blur of motion, faster than the figure could react. It grabbed the figure by the throat, its cold, clammy hand squeezing with a terrifying strength. The figure gasped, struggling to break free, but the grip was unyielding, like iron. A strange, wet sound echoed from the thing's throat as it leaned closer, its eyes dark with hunger. The figure's vision blurred, its air supply cutting off, and the world began to spin. But through the haze, one thought cut through the terror. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Gary, or whatever had replaced him, was still here. And it was coming for more. The thing's grip tightened. And then, in a final desperate surge, the figure managed to break free. It stumbled backward, hands clutching at its throat, gasping for air. But the thing didn't stop. It turned, following, its movements jerky and violent. It was relentless. It wasn't just trying to kill. It was hunting. The figure had no time to think. No time to plan. It dashed toward the hallway, hearing the shuffling footsteps closing in behind. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly before it, swallowing everything. The house had become a maze. A trap. The figure pushed through the narrow hall, its breath ragged. It had to get out. Had to escape. But as it reached the door, a thought flashed through its mind. It wasn't just one thing anymore. It wasn't just Gary. The house had changed. It had become something else. And everyone in it was trapped. Forever. The figure paused at the door, its hand trembling on the handle. Then, a sound behind it. A shuffle. A low, wet groan. It turned just in time to see the shape move closer. The thing wasn't alone. There were more. More like it. Gary wasn't the first. And it seemed he wouldn't be the last. The figure's mind raced, panic surging. The door was their only way out, but it was closing fast. The thing lunged. And just before the darkness swallowed everything, the figure knew. No one was getting out. Not alive. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, the sound echoing through the halls. The figure barely managed to dive out of the way as the thing lunged again. Its body hit the door with sickening force, the wood buckling under the pressure. The thing let out another raspy growl, its twisted face contorted in frustration, hunger. For a moment, there was silence. The figure crouched against the wall, gasping for air, its mind racing. The house felt alive now, every shadow a threat, every creak of the floorboards a warning. There was no escape. Not through the front door, not through the windows. The house was a maze, an endless, winding labyrinth of dark rooms and corridors. It had become something else entirely, something alive. The figure's eyes darted around the room, scanning for an exit. It was no use. Every path seemed blocked, every corner leading to another nightmare. The air in the house was thick now, heavy with the scent of decay. The walls felt closer, the floors colder, as if the house itself were closing in. The figure's heart pounded. It couldn't stop moving, couldn't afford to stop, even for a second. And then, a sound. A scrape. A whisper of movement in the hallway. The figure's breath caught in its throat. Something, or someone was coming closer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Too deliberate. The figure tensed, instinctively pressing itself into the shadows. It had to be careful. It couldn't let them see it. But as the footsteps grew louder, closer, the figure's eyes widened. There were more of them. The things, the twisted, broken things that had once been people, were everywhere. There were at least 5 now, moving in slow, jerky steps down the hallway, their faces blank, hollow. Eyes that were no longer human, but black and lifeless, flickering with an unnatural hunger. The figure's mind raced, trying to find a way out. There was no chance of making it through the front door. And there was no telling how many of them were out there now. But one thing was clear. They were hunting. Hunting for whoever was still alive. The figure's thoughts turned dark. It remembered the others, the people who had come to the house before, searching for answers, searching for Gary. Had they all fallen victim to whatever this thing was? Had they become part of it? The house, the creatures, it was all connected. It was all part of a twisted game. And the figure was the last piece. The last chance for survival. But as it crouched there, hidden in the shadows, its pulse racing, it heard something that froze its blood. A whisper. Soft. Barely audible. But unmistakable. Join us. The figure's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence. Something was calling to it. Something deep within the walls of the house. The voice had a pull, a magnetic force that tugged at the very core of its being. It could feel the lure, the temptation to just let go.
To stop fighting.
To surrender. But there was a flicker of resistance. A small, desperate part of it that refused to give in. The figure shook its head, forcing itself to focus. There was no time for weakness. The creatures were closer now, their steps coming faster, more erratic. They were hunting, but not just for food. They were hunting for something worse. The figure's hand went to the door, feeling for a way to open it. But the knob wouldn't turn. It was locked. It was always locked. A low growl echoed from the other side of the door. The figure's breath caught. It wasn't alone. The creatures were right there, on the other side, pounding against the door. The wood groaned under their weight. The figure backed away, retreating into the shadows, its mind spinning. There was no escape. Not anymore. The creatures were everywhere. And the house had won. The door gave way with a violent crash. And the last thing the figure saw before the darkness took over was their eyes. The endless, empty eyes, staring, waiting. For the final moment. For the end. The house had claimed its prize. The creatures poured into the room, their slow, dragging steps almost in sync, as if they were part of some twisted procession. Their eyes, black as coal, glistened in the dim light, reflecting the faint glow of the house's flickering lamps. The figure, backed into the farthest corner, felt the cold air press in around it, thick and suffocating. There was no escape now. No hope. The creatures closed in, their breath low and rasping, like the sound of rustling leaves or a distant wind. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence said everything. The figure pressed its back against the wall, the cold stone seeping through its clothes, but the chill of the room was nothing compared to the terror that gripped its chest. It could hear its own heartbeat, loud and erratic, pounding in its ears, drowning out everything else. The creatures stopped, just a few feet away. They didn't move forward. They didn't make another sound. The figure's breath quickened, but it didn't dare make a noise. Was this it? Was this how it would end? Frozen in fear, waiting for them to come closer? Then, one of the creatures stepped forward. Its body moved stiffly, jerking with each step. Its face, twisted and broken, stared at the figure with eyes that were not its own. But it was still there. A flicker of the person it had been. Gary? The figure couldn't tell. It didn't want to. It couldn't breathe. The creature stopped right in front of it, its breath hot and foul against the figure's face. Its eyes bored into the figure, cold and lifeless. And then a voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even a whisper. But it cut through the silence like a blade. Why do you fight? The figure's mouth went dry, but it managed to speak, though the words felt foreign. I can't. The creature's lips curled into a grotesque smile. It's already done, it said, its voice too soft, too calm. The figure's chest tightened. It could feel the walls closing in, the shadows pressing in from all sides. Join us, the creature whispered again. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The figure's mind raced. Escape.
Fight.
But where?
How?
The door behind the creature seemed so far away. Too far. The room felt like it was shrinking. The walls were shifting. Every corner was a trap. The house was alive. And it had been waiting for this. Waiting for the last soul to give in. The creature's hand reached out, long fingers brushing the figure's arm. Cold. Too cold. The figure shuddered, trying to pull away, but it was like the creature's touch had frozen it in place. Don't resist, it murmured, voice laced with something dark, almost seductive. Don't fight it, the figure's mind screamed. It couldn't give in. It wouldn't. But the pull was so strong. The urge to just stop fighting, to let go, to join them. It was overwhelming. The figure felt its knees begin to tremble. It couldn't fight anymore. Not against this. It didn't want to fight. But the last sliver of resistance, the last spark of fear, still held on. Then, A crash. The figure's head snapped toward the window. A dark shape slammed against it, breaking the glass with an explosion of shards. For a moment, everything stopped. The creatures hissed, recoiling. The figure's heart pounded. Someone was coming. Someone had heard the crash. But who? The shadows in the room flickered again. And in that brief moment, the figure darted forward, moving with a desperation it hadn't felt in ages. It grabbed a shard of glass from the floor, holding it like a weapon. There was no time for hesitation. No time for anything else. It had to get out. It had to survive. The creatures stirred again, but the figure was already running, dodging their reaching hands. The hallway was just ahead. The escape was within reach. But as it ran, it realized there was nowhere to go. Not really, because the house had already decided. And once it claimed its prize, there was no leaving. Not alive. The figure's feet hit the ground, pounding against the floor as it sprinted through the hallway, heart slamming against its ribs. It could hear the creature's movements behind it, the shuffle of their feet, their relentless pursuit. The air felt heavier, thick with a cold that seeped into the bones, and yet the figure's body burned with the effort to escape. The hallway stretched before it, endless, like some twisted funhouse. The shadows twisted, slithering across the walls, as if the house itself were alive, bent on pulling the figure back. Every corner seemed like a dead end. The figure could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. It glanced over its shoulder, just for a second. One of the creatures was closer now, its broken limbs jerking with unnatural speed. Its face, no, the thing's face, was a grotesque mockery of a human being, half decayed and hollow-eyed. It let out a low, guttural moan, but it wasn't pain or fear. It was hunger. The figure didn't dare look back again. It focused on the hallway ahead, the flickering light in the distance.
A door.
The figure's mind grasped at the possibility, but it wasn't sure if it was real. Was it an escape? Or another trap? It didn't care. It had no choice but to try. It pushed forward, its body aching, its legs threatening to give way. And then, as the figure reached the door, something terrible happened. The walls seemed to shift. The floor groaned, vibrating underfoot, like the house was waking up, stretching its bones. The door, it wasn't a door anymore. It was a wall. A solid, unyielding barrier. The figure slammed its fists against it, desperate, frantic. No. It stepped back, trembling, and looked around in a panic. The hallway was closing in. The creatures were almost upon it now. One of them reached out a hand, no, a claw, and gripped the figure's shoulder. The touch was cold, so cold it burned. The figure tried to twist away, but the grip was too strong. Its head snapped toward the thing's face, eyes wide with fear and desperation. It wanted to scream, but no sound came. The darkness was swallowing everything. It was like being dragged into a void, pulled down into something worse than death. The creature leaned in closer, its foul breath hot against the figure's ear. And then, the lights flickered. The world went black. When the figure opened its eyes again, it was no longer in the hallway. It was back in the living room, back in the place where it all began. But everything was different now. The air was thick with the smell of decay. The floor beneath it felt wet, slick, like the blood that had soaked into the floor earlier was rising again, as if the house was alive with it. And standing there in the center of the room was a figure, a silhouette. But this time, it wasn't the same. It wasn't Gary. The thing that had once been Gary had transformed into something else entirely. Its skin was peeling, like old paper, revealing the dark, twisted shape underneath. Its eyes, those eyes, were no longer hollow. They were full, brimming with an unnatural hunger. And in the center of its chest, something pulsed. A sickening, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat. But not human. The figure took a step forward, its limbs jerking as it moved. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of teeth that were sharp, like shards of glass. The figure stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was trapped again. And now there was no escape. The house had claimed its prize. And the figure was just another part of it. Just another lost soul. The last scream was cut short, and the darkness swallowed everything. The silence that followed was suffocating. The house stood still, as if holding its breath. The figure's body lay on the floor, still and lifeless, its eyes staring at nothing. The creatures, the things, surrounded it, but they didn't touch it. Not yet. Their hollow eyes scanned the room, moving like puppets on invisible strings, their motions stiff, robotic. They were waiting for something or someone to complete the cycle. And in the middle of it all, the thing that had once been Gary stood, watching, its breath slow and deep, as though savoring the moment. The pulse in its chest grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was alive, feeding off the fear, feeding off the souls trapped inside it. The air was thick with the stench of rot, a smell so heavy it made the figure's stomach turn, even in death. The walls, once painted in faded shades of gray, were now streaked with something darker, something viscous and black, like the blood of the house itself. The floor was slick, covered in the remnants of all those who had come before. The house wasn't just a building. It was a creature.
A beast.
And it had never been satisfied. The thing that had once been Gary stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the terror in the room. It crouched down beside the figure's body, its mouth opening, revealing those sharp, jagged teeth. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of its breath, deep and steady. Then it whispered, just loud enough to be heard. "You're part of it now." The words sent a shiver through the air, like an electric shock. The figure's body twitched, as if the words had triggered something deep inside, something buried under layers of fear and death. It wasn't dead. Not really. The thing that had once been Gary smiled, or what passed for a smile, a grotesque twist of its lips. And as it did, the air seemed to hum with power. The walls trembled, the house groaning in protest. The pulse in the creature's chest quickened. Suddenly, the room exploded with sound, an agonized screech that cut through the air like nails on glass. The walls began to crack. The floor trembled, as if the house itself were waking up. The figure's eyes snapped open, wide with terror. It couldn't move. It couldn't scream. But it was aware that it was no longer alone in its own body. The house had claimed another. And it wasn't done yet. The thing that had once been Gary reached out with one clawed hand, grasping the figure's wrist with an unnatural strength. It yanked the figure's body upright, forcing it to stand, even though every fiber of its being screamed in protest. The creature's eyes locked onto the figure's, dark and empty, as it whispered again, "Come join us." The figure's body trembled, not out of fear, but out of something darker. Something that wasn't its own will. It could feel the darkness inside the house, creeping under its skin, invading its mind, taking control. It was happening again. The creature's grip tightened. The walls of the house seemed to bend inward, closing in, suffocating, as though the house itself was a living entity, hunting, feeding. And then the most horrifying thing happened. From every corner, every shadow in the room, the other creatures began to move. They didn't walk. They shuffled. They dragged themselves, their broken limbs jerking as if they were puppets on a string. And their eyes, those black, empty eyes, all of them turned toward the figure, and a low, guttural sound began to rise from deep within them. A chant, a song, a ritual. The house had claimed its newest victim. The figure's body moved involuntarily, dragged along by the twisted hands of the creatures. There was no fight left. No resistance. Only the pull of the darkness. The chanting grew louder. The walls seemed to pulsate in rhythm with the sound, a sickening, thumping beat that matched the rhythm of the figure's heartbeat. And then, the most chilling thing of all happened. The figure's mouth opened. But the words it spoke weren't its own. "They will all join us." The voice was cold. It was the voice of the house. And it wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. It had all the time in the world. And it would claim every soul that wandered too close until there was nothing left. Nothing but the darkness. The darkness stretched beyond comprehension, filling every inch of the house, seeping into the bones of its victims, grinding them down until they were no longer even human. The figure's body moved in perfect sync with the others, a puppet to the will of the house, a vessel of the endless hunger that churned inside the walls.
There was no escaping it now.
The creatures circled, their voices low and guttural, a chant that echoed through the cold, suffocating air. It was a hymn, a prayer, a ritual, but not for salvation, for consumption, for transformation. The figure's eyes, now just dull reflections of the thing that had once been its soul, stared blankly ahead, seeing nothing. It was too late for understanding, too late to remember what it had been. The walls of the house creaked and groaned again, as though reacting to the final step in the ritual. The floor beneath them shuddered. The air thickened, as if every breath drew the figure closer to an endless abyss. The other creatures moved, their stiff limbs creaking like the branches of dying trees. They were all part of the house now. Each one was a fragment of something that had once been human, now twisted and broken into a grotesque parody of life. They whispered to each other, the words incomprehensible, the sounds a mixture of hunger and despair. And the house listened. It waited. The darkness that surrounded them seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. The walls pulsed with an alien heartbeat. And deep beneath the floorboards, beneath the earth, something stirred. Something ancient. Something even more terrifying than the creatures roaming the halls. The figure could feel it too. A presence. A force. And as the ritual continued, as the creatures drew closer, the final step was near. One by one, they took their place around the figure. Their touch was cold, their hands grasping at the figure's skin, pulling it closer to the center of the circle. And then, the house trembled again. It shook violently, as though it were alive, as though it could no longer contain its hunger. The floor cracked open, revealing a darkness so deep that it swallowed all light, all sound. A chasm that seemed to go on forever. And from that abyss, something began to rise. It was slow at first, the edges of the darkness seeping up through the cracks in the floor, like ink spreading through water. But then, it erupted. A wave of pure, unfathomable terror, the sound of it deafening, the darkness spilling into the room, swallowing everything in its path. The figure screamed, but it was a sound that wasn't its own, a hollow cry that reverberated through the house, through the walls, through the very air itself. The creatures joined in, their voices merging with the figure's scream, as if they were all one. And then, in that moment, it stopped. The sound, the movement, the house itself went still, frozen in the grip of its own power. The darkness receded, pulling back into the depths of the earth, dragging everything down with it. And for a moment there was nothing. No sound. No movement. No breath. Just silence. But that silence was worse than anything, because the house was still there. It was waiting, and it would never stop. It would never let go. The figure, now just a hollow shell, stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the others, forever part of the house, forever part of the endless darkness. And the last, horrible truth settled in. The house had been waiting for them all along. It didn't just consume bodies. It consumed souls. And now there were no souls left to claim. Only emptiness. Only the hunger. And the house. The house was eternal. The silence stretched out, thick and oppressive. For a moment, there was nothing but the heavy, suffocating air. The house itself seemed to breathe, slow and deep, like a living creature, its pulse resonating beneath the figure's feet. The walls, now slick with something dark and viscous, seemed to twitch, as if alive. The figure's limbs felt heavy, like lead, each movement an effort. But it didn't need to move. It couldn't. Not anymore. There was no escape. No hope. The creatures, the things that had once been human, stood frozen around the figure, their eyes vacant, their bodies unmoving. They were no longer part of the world they had known. They were a part of the house now. A part of the hunger. The darkness that had once filled the floor now spread outward, seeping into the very air, filling every crevice, every corner of the room. It clung to the walls, the ceiling, the very bones of the house itself. There was a strange, almost familiar sound, the sound of a door creaking open. But it wasn't the front door. It wasn't the back. It wasn't even a door at all. It was the walls themselves, groaning, shifting, opening up as though they were welcoming something or someone inside. The figure's eyes, now cold and hollow, watched in quiet horror as something began to emerge from the shadows. A figure, a silhouette, barely visible, standing at the threshold of the room. It was tall, taller than any of the creatures, and its presence seemed to distort the air around it. Its shape was almost human, but something was wrong. Something that made the hairs on the back of the figure's neck stand up. The room seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that the figure's breath misted in front of its face. And then, the figure stepped forward. It was slow, deliberate, each footfall echoing in the thick silence. As it moved closer, the light shifted. It wasn't the dim flicker of the house's failing lamps anymore. It was a harsh, unnatural glow, green and sickly, seeping from the figure's form. The creature's face, if you could even call it a face, was obscured, hidden in the shadows of its hood. But the eyes gleamed in the dark, bright, piercing, and endless. The figure wanted to look away, but it couldn't. It was trapped in those eyes, pulled into them as though they were a force of their own. The figure's breath came in shallow gasps, the realization sinking in like ice. This wasn't just another creature. This was something else. Something worse. It wasn't the house. It was the thing behind the house. The entity that had summoned it. The one that had orchestrated the death of everyone who had dared enter this cursed place. The one who had been waiting for the moment when it could take everything. The figure could feel the weight of the thing's gaze pressing down on it, like a vice. It was drawing closer, and the house seemed to bend and groan, as if it were terrified of this presence. The other creatures, those that had once been human, moved aside, as if compelled by some invisible force. And then the entity spoke. Its voice was like the sound of 1,000 whispers, layered over each other, incomprehensible, yet maddening in its clarity. Time is not a thing to be wasted. The words reverberated through the figure's mind, scraping at its sanity. It wanted to scream, to run, but there was no movement left. No escape. The creature's hand, blackened and skeletal, reached out, hovering just above the figure's head. A wave of icy cold washed over the room as it came closer. The figure's body tensed, as if it knew what was coming. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of decay, and the pulse in the walls quickened, a frantic throb like a beating heart. The figure could feel it, the presence drawing closer, its touch now almost within reach. And then, a sharp pain, like 1,000 needles piercing the skin at once. The figure gasped, its vision blurring, as if the darkness had taken hold, tearing it apart from the inside. It was not just its body that was being consumed. It was its soul, its very essence. The house was alive, and now it was feasting. The entity loomed over the figure, its cold, glowing eyes watching as the last remnants of the figure's humanity began to fade away, swallowed by the void. And then nothing. The figure was gone. Just another lost soul, devoured by the insatiable hunger of the house. And as the room fell silent once more, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, darker, until there was nothing left. Nothing but the house, the hunger, and the eternal waiting. The air was thick with the weight of silence, so deep that it felt suffocating. The house, once alive with screams and terror, now stood in eerie stillness. Its walls, broken and stained, seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm, pulsing with the force of something far older than the house itself. Beneath the floorboards, something stirred, an ancient, restless thing that had been waiting for this moment. The house had claimed all it needed.
But still, it was not finished.
Not yet. The figure, what remained of it, stood motionless, its body drained of all life, a hollow shell caught between two worlds. Its eyes, once filled with fear, were now empty, lost in the void of the house. It was no longer part of the world it had known. It was part of something darker. The creatures that had once been human, those twisted things that had followed the same path, now stood around it, their eyes blank, lifeless, yet somehow still watching. They had become the house. The walls, the floor, the very air, they all seemed to feed off the souls trapped inside. And then, without warning, the floor groaned beneath them. A low, unsettling sound that shook the entire house. The figure's hollow eyes lifted, drawn to the farthest corner of the room. A soft flicker of light, pale and sickly, began to shimmer in the shadows. It was subtle at first, like the glimmer of a star in the darkest night, but it grew. Slowly, painfully, the light spread, reaching toward the center of the room. The figure's senses flared, though it had no control over its body anymore. The house was awakening. The house had never truly been dormant. The entity that had existed within it, the thing that had brought the darkness, the hunger, was now returning. The light was no longer soft. It burned, an unholy glow that spread through the room like fire. The creatures hissed, recoiling, their twisted forms contorting as the light touched them. But they could not escape. They were bound to the house. And the house was now awake, hungry. The pulse beneath the floorboards quickened, a terrible rhythm that mirrored the pounding of a heart, deep, relentless. The light flared brighter, the room filled with a hum, a song, ancient and primal, impossible to ignore. And then the figure felt it, the sharp pull, the call to come closer. The darkness had not just consumed the souls. It had reawakened them. As the light reached its apex, the walls seemed to fold inward. The floor cracked open, and the figure, still caught in the web of the house, could only feel the coldness spread once again, deeper into the soul, until there was no more resistance. Only the house, only the hunger, and only the endless night that would never end. The house had claimed everything, and it would never be satisfied. The house stood still, its walls now silent, its hunger sated for a moment. The storm had passed. The air, thick with the stench of decay and something darker, seemed to settle around it, suffocating. But the hunger, deep within the bones of the house, was never truly gone. It was patient. It had always been patient. Outside, the world continued, oblivious to the terror hidden just beyond the walls of that cursed place. The house, with all its twisted, living presence, was an anomaly, an aberration. It existed outside of time, outside of logic, a blight upon the earth. And it waited. The thing that had once been Gary, now more a part of the house than ever, walked slowly through the rooms, its once human eyes now cold and unblinking. The other souls, those who had been consumed, twisted by the house's terrible hunger, moved with it, an endless procession of bodies trapped in the same fate, their forms just shadows of what they had been. But there was something different now. The house had consumed them all, yet there was no satisfaction. No end. It was as if the hunger had only grown with every soul added to its dark collection. The walls creaked, groaned with a renewed energy. The pulse beneath the floor grew louder again, the rhythm of it echoing in the air. It was not the same as before. It had shifted. It had adapted. The darkness had learned. And now, as the last remnants of the souls trapped inside began to fade, the house seemed to grow, expanding like an organism feeding off its own darkness. It was reaching beyond its physical boundaries, beyond the walls of the forsaken house, stretching its influence into the night, into the unknown. Far beyond the decaying walls, the moon rose, casting pale light over the land. But it was not a peaceful moon. It was sickly, waning, as if it too could feel the reach of the house. And in that fleeting moment, the stillness of the house was shattered. A final, terrible sound. A shift in the air. A signal that something new was coming. The house had fed long enough. It was time to search again. To find the next souls. And to claim them. The shadows of the house reached farther now. The door would open again. The hunger would never end.
Not while the house still stood.
It was eternal.